And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of StillCurtain.com. Joining me, as always, is Shayne Kubas, contributor for Still Curtain. Shayne, I busted myself up a few days ago, so I'm going to try to power through this episode in a little bit of pain. I thought I ruptured my Achilles there, but it turns out it's just some sort of calf pull or something. So we're going to see if that swelling goes down here soon. Definitely some interesting news as we start this week. And we've gone like a month without anything tangible at all.
Right
now, and we're just relying on these silly Madden ratings we're going to talk about here in just a second. So, but Alex Highsmith signed to a 4-year, $68 million extension today, depending on how you want to look at it. The 4-year, 68. If you add this year, it kind of scraps the final year and tax that on. So 5 years, $70 million sounds better. But it is what it is. Highsmith is part of the Steelers game plan for the future. We're going to talk about him a lot today, breaking down if this decision was justified, the amount of money that he's making, and what to expect from him in the future, Shayne. But let's start with some of the other things that are going around in the news cycle this week. And we'll start right off with the Madden rating. So slow releasing their ratings as if it's like some sort of big event or whatever. So apparently it draws a big enough crowd for them to be able to do that still.
Yeah.
But let's just talk about what we know real quick. Steelers top 3 players. They haven't released all the ratings yet, but I'm sure that these are the guys.
Yeah.
TJ Watt is a 94 overall on the game. Cameron Hayward's a 93, and Minkah Fitzpatrick is also a 93. None of the 3 players, despite their 3-time first-team All-Pro appearances, are the top player at their position. Watt trails Nick Bosa and Myles Garrett. Those guys are both 98s. He's a 94. I know some fans are upset about that. Minkah is not the top safety, despite having a remarkable season. I think the best of his career last year. That belongs to Derwin James, who played fewer games because of injuries and has actually only had 4 interceptions since his rookie season. Minkah had 6 last year, led the league. And then Cameron Hayward coming in a little bit lower than fans would have liked to see at his position. Shayne, do you care at all about these Madden ratings? And do they irk you a little bit, even if like, you know, that it's not anything that's, I don't know, tangible?
So I think that the problem with it is like, so I am someone who begrudgingly plays the game pretty often because I do love the NFL, and it's the only thing we got, unfortunately. So I always hope that they try to do better with the ratings every year, but I also know that they're not going to, right? Like we kind of know the ratings a lot of the time aren't based on anything tangible, at least not anything that is based in their real life skills. A lot of the time, there's times where guys who are clearly not a certain type of player are kind of billed as one in Madden. And when it comes to TJ Watt, like they're dinging him for injury. Like that's what's happening. They've never really given him the love as like the top edge rusher in the NFL, despite his production in the past. But he's being dinged a little bit because of his injuries, which if you're going to do that, whatever, just make it consistent, which they don't. And then Cameron Hayward, I think he's rated fairly in terms of the game. I think it's just the fact that like he isn't going to have the athletic ratings that they really prioritize for the overall. So he has all of the intangible stuff, all like strength, awareness, all that good stuff. But because he's not, he is not a young player and he's never been unbelievable athlete, especially, in a straight line, his rating is going to be a little bit lower than maybe it would be otherwise. And then Minkah, Derwin James is the highest rated safety because of how many things he theoretically can do. Like that's why his overall is higher, right? Like that's fine in the context of the
Derwin's
game.
Good.
Yeah. It's
no
just
knock on him at all.
Exactly. But like in the context of the game, it makes sense for a guy that has the skill set to be rated higher because Minkah's isn't necessarily not versatile, obviously, but it's more focused in a specific area of coverage and, deep safety ability, whereas Derwin is more of a hybrid player in a lot of ways. So at the end of the day, these ratings don't mean anything, obviously, because unless you're playing the game a lot, and even if you do, you could just change them. That's the thing that cracks me up is like, if they wouldn't let you change ratings, which I'm glad they do because it makes it customizable, but you can just change things that you don't like. Like once the game comes out, there's people who I've even been in them, like where you make your own roster, you do your own, like you make it more realistic to what goes on in the NFL, like whether it's rating spread or whatever, like you could just change it. So it's fine. It doesn't matter. Like it really isn't something to be worried about right now.
Yeah, maybe go and download somebody else's roster on purchase of the game. I can't see any bias taking place there at all, Shayne, with people just going and changing their own ratings.
Not at all. No. Absolutely not.
It is interesting though. I mean, again, I haven't bought the game for myself in a couple of years now, but I was a big Madden fan. Like
you're better off.
I used to play it all the time. But it's interesting, some of the ratings that they choose to hand out, or some of the even like the individual skills, like Minka not getting a top 10 like catching score among safeties. I'm like,
It's
what does he
weird,
have to
yeah.
do kind of
Yeah,
to
it's
prove
just
that? I
weird,
mean,
yeah.
so, but anyway, a few other ones here, just to note real quick. Najee's rating came out today. He's an 83 overall. Interestingly, Deontay Johnson is an 82. George Pickens is an 80 overall. The Steelers do not have a receiver ranked inside the top 32 in the NFL. I mean, I think within a few overall points, these guys are probably where you expect them to be, right?
Roughly. Yeah, roughly. I mean, the one actually that stands out to me that's been revealed so far that I'm not a fan of is the fact that Isaac Seumalo is only a 78. And
That is interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
after the season he came off of last year with the Eagles, and I understand like they're probably trying not to overrate him because of the Eagles line, but like
Mm-hmm.
he's just a better player right now than any of our other offensive linemen. He just is. Like nothing against James Daniels who's an 80, but like I think he's the most like sound
Yeah.
structured player on the team right now in terms of the offensive line. So that surprised me a little bit. Everything else is kind of in line with
Mm-hmm.
what I expected going back to the end of last year with Madden 2, because their
Yeah.
ratings, they change, but a lot of the time, unless no new information has been brought up, they're going to be pretty similar. So
It is a little odd. I mean, Seumalo graded out as the 10th best guard in the NFL last year, according to Pro Football Focus. Went
yeah.
back and watched some of the film. I thought the film was really good. So it just makes you wonder, like, what justifies the ratings? Like, why is he a 79 while Najee, who's coming off not a very efficient year, is an 83? Who knows? I mean, it is what it is. If you don't like the rosters, go and adjust them
Yeah, like I
yourself, I
said,
guess.
yeah, do that. Yeah.
Let's talk for a minute, Shayne, about the disgruntled running backs. Another probably the biggest overall topic happening in the NFL this
Yes.
week. Obviously, there was a trio of running backs who were set to begrudgingly play under the franchise tag this year. Saquon Barkley, Tony Pollard, who's the third one that I'm missing here, drawing a blank off the top of
Josh
my head.
Jacobs.
Josh Jacobs. And now they all will play under the tag because none of them were able to come to terms with their team on a long-term deal. They not only voiced their frustration, but they had multiple running backs coming out and having their back. Derrick Henry, Austin Eckler, guys have retired, Le'Veon Bell, and they're all shouting the same story here, and that's pay running backs. They're underpaid. They're mistreated. And I get that, Shayne. I get that. The problem is, I've been saying this for years. I think the owners are finally starting to do the right thing with the position. As sad as that is for them specifically, there's just not enough evidence to say that you should be paying running backs massive second contracts with tons of guaranteed money.
And I think this is the crux of the issue. Is it's really for most people, I would say, right? Anyone who's not on their side in terms of thinking that they should get paid based on their value to teams, they're not saying it because they don't care about these players or they don't want them to get paid. But they understand, as a lot of us do, that at this point in the NFL, it's just doesn't the math doesn't work out where it makes sense to pay these guys, most of them, a second contract. There are certain players who are elite players who you're not going to be able to replace necessarily, at least not even enough of their production to make it make sense, right?
Yeah.
But outside of those few guys, and some of those guys I would argue are currently going to be playing the franchise tag, so that creates another issue. But the point of it is there's only so many guys who are worth that second contract, whether it's because they're so much better than other backs or because they have a diverse skill set like a Christian McCaffrey or Saquon Barkley, like guys like that. Outside of them, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to invest a significant amount of money into the position because we've seen teams that win the Super Bowl go deep in the playoffs. They just oftentimes don't have a running back that's either the bell cow or if there is a bell cow, he's on a rookie contract. And it hurts the running backs the most because unlike pretty much every other position in the sport, their prime starts in their rookie contract. Like that's when their prime is athletically,
Yeah, it
physically,
does.
their ability to take those hits. They start off in their prime essentially coming out of college a lot of the time. Some guys do catch on a little bit later and they end up being productive, but in general, most guys they hit the ground running and then that they have that 4 or 5 year runway and then they're done. And is it fair to them? Absolutely not. I think the rookie contract structure that's been changed since 2010, I think it was, that lowered those amounts by a lot because it structured them instead of a team just being able to pay them whatever they thought they were worth being paid. Did disproportionately affect them because now that is in place, you can get a running back on a third or fourth round deal, and he's done by the time that deal's over, and you don't have to pay him, right? So he made, a lot of money, obviously, compared to the average person, but for the NFL,
Mhm.
not as much as he probably should have based on his value to the team, right? So it's a really tough situation. I don't really know if there's a great solution here because they're not suddenly going to start paying them like they think they should be paid because clearly they're learning, like you said, that that's just not a good way to build a team. But teams continue to take them pretty high in the draft because they know they are valuable in that short-term window. So there's going to
Mhm.
be this disparity of like most of the highest paid running backs in the NFL, probably in 4 or 5 years, are going to be guys on first round contracts. Like that's going to be the highest paid running backs. Like Bijan, I think this year
Mhm.
is one of the highest paid running backs in the NFL because he was drafted 8th overall. Like
Yeah.
that's kind of what it is. And you hope that something will change for them just because you don't want to see guys, especially guys like them that take all the punishment, take all the beating, not get paid for it. But there's a reason why. It's not like they're just deciding like, "Oh,
Mhm.
we don't wanna pay you guys anymore." It's like there's a reason analytically and just sense-wise, like, you just don't need to do it to win a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the proof is in the pudding here too. And you look at Super Bowls; these are quarterbacks; these aren't running backs. Now, running games matter.
They do.
Running backs, not so much. And I think that there's
Individually, yes. Yeah.
yes, because so much is dependent on their success anyway, in terms of the scheme, the play calling, the blocking up front. Typically, most running backs, you're going to get what's blocked for you, and then a little bit after that. Now, the really good ones, the McCaffreys and the Chubbs of the world, they're going to go above and beyond a little bit,
Yes.
but you can only do so much. You can only break so many tackles and get so many yards after the catch. And like you said, Shayne, unless you're a dynamic receiver, kind of like McCaffrey is, where you really add an element right there, those are the guys that deserve the second contracts. Those guys that can last longer strictly because of their receiving ability. But from an owner's perspective, if you're just going to draft one to run the wheels off, kind of like the Steelers have been doing with Najee a little bit, and like they've done in the past with Le'Veon Bell, if that is your purpose and that's what you intend to do with that running back, then as sad as it is, and as well as they're not protected, it's still the right decision in terms of finances for your team and for your future.
Yeah.
Because if the running back that you're playing there now has almost no tread left on the tires, why pay them 15, 16, $18 million a year when you can just throw another day 2 pick back into the position and just recycle, draft and repeat, draft and repeat. And so I don't know how this gets resolved, Shayne, between the NFLPA and between the owners. And I just don't know if there's a good solution for it, because you can't really take the years down on the rookie contracts. If you do that and you say, oh, running backs have fewer years, all of a sudden, nobody's going to draft them high. Yeah. And so, but if you leave things the way they are right now, running backs will continue to be used and abused until the league, if it ever shifts back the other direction. And I just don't know if that's going to happen, because it is such a passing league right now, dominated by quarterbacks and not at all by running backs. And so I don't know if this is something that will be self-correcting or not. My suggestion to anybody out there who has not reached that stage, if you are a really good high school football player, can you still hear me, Shayne?
Yeah, I got you. Yep.
Okay, my screen just blacked out. My screen just blacked out on me here for a second. If you are a good high school football player and you have NFL aspirations, I would suggest don't become a running back. Like if you are good enough to,
yeah,
it's just the way that it is right now. They do get used and abused, and most of them don't get a second contract. And if they do, it's not very much. They'll slap a franchise tag on you. They'll do other things to get around that. But they're just not going to make as much money in their career as some of the other positions will. I mean, there's the debate going on right now, even, Shayne, are running backs even as valuable as what kickers are? And I think there's a case to be made that if you look at a case by case basis here, like I'm sorry, but I think I would take Justin Tucker over any running back in the league. I just think that having the surefire ability to get 3 points when you're at midfield or earlier, I mean, that's 3 points. Running backs are going to get me. They're going to be able to replicate a lot of what the star players can do. And I know this is controversial. I know that it is. But good running backs can only get you so far. They depend on so many factors. And even like, look at Nick Chubb, for example. The Browns have had Callahan as their offensive line coach, the best in the game. They've had multiple all-pro offensive linemen over the years where Chubb has been so good. It's really hard to find these examples, Shayne, of elite running backs that don't have elite pieces around them helping them get to that point. And so for me, I'm not paying running backs. That it's just not the way that I would operate the business, but I know that to each their own. And the Steelers' philosophy is kind of backwards on that. And so let's pivot here, Shayne, and talk about Najee Harris. He was one of the running backs, again, who came out advocating that running backs are misused and they need to be paid more. Does he have a right to be upset considering his current situation and the fact that things have not gone particularly well for him so far early in his career?
So I think he probably is one of the guys that doesn't have a right to be upset yet because he was a first round pick at running back. So he's getting paid pretty well considering his position at this point in the league. Now he has a right to be upset for the position, just like every other running back does. I think the overall advocacy of trying to get this in a position where they're not going to be, really taken out of the market essentially for the most part, like that he has a right to be upset about, and so does every other running back. But he's in a position right now where especially because he's on the Steelers, if he does produce better behind a better offensive line, and again, we've seen part of the problem for any running back is when the offensive line isn't very good. One, their either confidence starts to fall apart or they start to fall apart in terms of their ability to make plays. And this is a guy with Najee that because of the way he plays, when he does get ahead of steam going and he does have room to run, that's when the magic starts happening. But he doesn't a lot of the time. Because of that, he hasn't been able to make up for it in terms of his efficiency or anything else because of that fact. And you hope it changes this year, but if it does, he's one of the few guys that might get paid because the Steelers do stuff like that. But it's still not going to be paid in the way that even like the Le'Veon Bell contract they offered Bell back in the day. Like that contract's never going to happen again, I don't think, for any team really, especially not for a player that isn't the top of the position, which granted Bell was at the time, but he did have a lot of tread on the tires. So his right to be upset is about his future possibly and the current state of running back contracts across the league. But him personally, I don't think he has much to be upset about right now.
Yeah, I think it's definitely that preemptive measure. Like,
yes,
I'm going to make sure I
want to be involved in this.
Yeah,
right now too.
I'm going to speak out right now because a couple of years from now, I want to be raking in the money, and we'll see how that goes. I mean, obviously things need to get better for him. It's important to note though, too, Shayne, that Omar Khan, Andy Waddle, these guys did not draft Najee Harris. That was Kevin Colbert. And so it makes you wonder how tied to them they will be. And so let's talk about what Najee needs to prove here in 2023 and in his last contract year. I just think that he's come so far short right now, Shayne, in terms of expectations. When you have that first round pick, you expect a lot. So many factors here, obviously. People will point to the injuries, the Liz Frank, the plate in his foot, just being nicked and bruised up here, and not having a great offensive line to boot. And so those things definitely matter a lot. But again, Shayne, the fact that they matter might show that those things are more important than who actually is in the tailback position there. And so what do you think Najee has to do? Like, what does this season need to look like right now before the Steelers front office and Khan and Waddle get into that situation where they're like, all right, now we're legitimately looking at what a second contract could look like for you?
So I think there's three main things that has to happen. One, the offensive line has to do their part and give him the opportunity to show what he can do, right? Because that has been a big part of it, right? This is a guy that, because of the way he plays, if he doesn't have the space he needs to at least get up into the second level to show the power, the agility in space despite his size, it's not going to look pretty a lot of the time, right? And that's the case with any running back, but especially one like him. So that has to happen first before we can even wonder what else might happen. But then the second thing to me is his ability to break tackles has to get better than it's been, because when he has had opportunity to break tackles, it hasn't been at the level that I think he's capable of. And I think part of that was probably last year injuries, like that. Just the ability to evade tacklers as well wasn't quite there. But he's shown that, especially his rookie year, he did show the evasiveness and the elusiveness at times. That needs to get back up to, an even higher level than that. And the number one thing, and this is kind of alluded to what we talked about before, he has to show better receiving chops, because he wasn't given many good opportunities. But one, they need to use him more as a true receiver because he showed a lot of that at Alabama. I don't have any qualms about him as a pass catcher, but they need to get him in better positions to actually get in open space and punish guys trying to tackle him downhill. Like, that's what needs to happen. And part of that is going to be the scheme, and the play calling needs to get better. But if it does and he still doesn't produce the passing game, it's going to be a tough sell to give him any significant money on a second contract.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And if you're not going to be the fastest running back, I mean, he's not going to be a guy that's ever one of the top in the league in his explosive play rate, because chunking off those 20-yard plays is just not going to come as easy to him as it's going to be for a guy with legitimate 4.4 speed.
Right.
Now, in order for him to be the best version of himself on the football field, like in his skill set, he needs to be like Marshawn Lynch-like or
Yes.
Steven Jackson-like in terms of being able to throw defenders off of you and consistently get that extra yardage.
And he's
I think
shown
that,
it, but consistently
he has
show
shown
that.
it. The consistency is going to be the thing, and obviously health has something to do with that as well. It's just when you look at efficiency numbers right now, Shayne, and it's kind of, I mean, this really is the way that teams should be breaking things down, because what's more important than the efficiency? And if you just don't have it, then I don't care. I really don't care what your raw stats look like. If you're getting 1,500 yards, but your run success rate is low and your yards per carry are low, and nothing else looks spectacular that way, that those things don't matter as much. So it's all about the efficiency. And that's why I'm really interested to see how the dynamics is going to work in the backfield this year with a player like Jaylen Warren, who was, again, it's much smaller sample size, but significantly more efficient than Najee Harris was last year. And that was Warren's rookie year. I'd like to see that balance come back a little bit. Hopefully it's Najee going up to his level and not Warren coming down in terms of efficiency. Right. If they can both be as efficient as Warren was on that smallish sample size last year, then Steelers are going to have a really good run game. Yeah. But I do think that to be the best version of himself on the football field, he needs to start looking like Marshawn Lynch out there, because that's how he's going to win in terms of doing himself a favor and making himself some money here for the future. If it looks like it does the past 2 years, Shayne, I don't even think the Steelers are having a conversation in the offseason about a contract extension. I really don't. And this is a team that has been very loyal to their football players, but he definitely needs to take a step forward this year. All right. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Steel Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. And if you are joining us live here on YouTube, please drop your questions into the chat. We would love to answer them for you here. All right, Shayne, let's talk about Alex Highsmith and his new 4-year, $68 million deal. That doesn't include this year. So 5 years, $70 million in total. Him and TJ Watt are going to be around together for a long time now. And that part is encouraging. That part is nice. The fan base is a little bit split right now. Most are okay with it because, again, you're locking up a player. You're not waiting until training camp or letting him pass all the way through the season. Kind of like what Kevin Colbert did with TJ Watt until he finally marched into the facilities like, I'm signing my deal before the season starts. The first sign that I thought something like that might happen was last year in June. Omar Khan was much quicker than we expected to make Minka the highest paid safety in the NFL. And so at a similar time frame, roughly a month later, 1 year later, Alex Highsmith gets his deal 10 days before training camp even starts. And so I like that part of it. The question becomes, are we okay with the $17 million a year new money price point? That puts him roughly 10th in the NFL in new money average. Is Alex Highsmith a top 10 edge defender? I don't think so. I think he's outside of that, Shayne, but it doesn't really work that way. It goes off of your production. A lot, your age matters a lot. And so the guys leapfrog each other all the time in terms of the salary cap. But what is your first thoughts on the Highsmith contract extension and where the numbers came in?
So I think our question obviously is, was the contract justified, right? And I think that based on last year, it'd be hard to say no. And that's kind of the whole thing with it is, if he continues to play at the level he did last year, this contract will become something no one ever talks about, right? Like, this won't be something everyone's like, oh, I can't believe Alex Highsmith is making 17 million. Like, it's just not going to happen, right? Not just from a production standpoint, but from what he looked like on the field in general. No one will have any qualms with the price. However, if he doesn't play up to that level, or at least close to it, this year specifically, questions are already going to start coming, because this is a guy that was a mid-round pick that wasn't really viewed as a true like long-term starter type, at least by a lot of draft analysts. I did like him coming out, but not anything special. And then we saw what he's done the past couple of years, and I think he's earned the right to get this contract. I think it's just going to be, does it age well? Does he get even better? Because then it's a bargain. If you get any better than he was last year, 17 million for an edge rusher like him is not going to be something you really even think about, especially because, like you said, it puts him in fringe top 10 territory for new money. But that number, he's going to be in the mid to late teens by the end of the next season. Like, by the end of this season, someone else is going to get paid. Another guy, like, it's going to look better in terms of ranking contracts very soon, because there's guys who are going to get new deals here. But in general, like, the Steelers clearly have a plan on their defense, right? It's about getting after the quarterback as fast as we can so that when the ball gets thrown up out of desperation, Minka's back there and he'll take it back for you. Like that's the whole plan here, right? That's the idea. And I can't say I disagree because it's worked in the past, and I think it's going to continue to work this year defensively. But it becomes a question of asset allocation. We're going to talk about that next here, but overall, I like the deal because I think he can play at that level long term. So you might as well get it locked up right now so you don't have to worry about someone else getting paid in the same range and then have to up that to close to 20 million. And again, this is Khan jumping the gun to make sure that, okay, we have our guy next to TJ. We don't have to worry about that for a few years.
Yeah, the Steelers value continuity maybe more than any team in the league.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's obviously valuable to them. Also, you consider TJ Watt's health. I mean, it's at the very least an insurance policy for that, because we saw how bad the depth is outside of their first two guys there. And now you bring in Marcus Golden, who's just going to be a temporary player for the Steelers. But it is nice to have a little bit of security there and say, these are our two guys moving forward. It doesn't mean the Steelers can't spend a third-round pick or even a second-round pick on a pass rusher over the next year or two.
You need more than two.
Come in. Yeah, you need two rotations, really, is
ideally,
what you need.
Yes. You need at least
and the
four
Steelers
guys
haven't been deploying that, and I think that's part of the reason why maybe Watt has been getting injured too many snaps. I mean, the Peck thing was just kind of fluky. That was week one, so it's not like he was worn down. So injuries happen, but considering TJ Watt's injury history, it is nice to have that security of him now being part of the team for the foreseeable future. Do I like where the numbers came in? I would have preferred it a little bit lower. They didn't surprise me at all. I projected he would be in the 16 to 18 million per year new money average. It's pretty easy to figure this kind of stuff out when you compare him to other NFL players and what they earned and the statistics they had prior to their contracts. And so the money was actually pretty easy to figure out. It wasn't a question of where the money would come in. It was more of a question of, would you do this? And that is the question that has the fan base a little bit split right now. I know there are even some within the Steelers media who said I wouldn't have gone a penny over 15 million. And I get that mindset too, but it's like, are you going to let 2 million decide?
That's just what happened with the Giants and Barkley. They were $2 million apart, and guess what? He's their offense. So like
I know. So I'll be interested to see how that ends up unfolding as well. But it's like, you've got a player who turns 26 this training camp, and it probably has his brightest years ahead of him. Are you going to let the difference between $2 million say, no, I'm putting my foot down. I'm absolutely not doing it. There are ways to maneuver the salary cap. There are ways to clear up more money. I would have liked it better in the $14-15 million range. Obviously, it saves the Steelers a little bit. And Shayne, I think, honestly, if Highsmith doesn't explode for 14.5 sacks last year, if he only gets in the 9 or 10 range, we are looking at that number. We are looking at a lower per year salary. And so that's the thing that's a little bit unfortunate Highsmith had so much of his production alongside TJ Watt, which is great. I'm not taking anything away from him at all. He's been outstanding. You talk about a walk-on guy, former third-round pick. But if he just has a few less sacks in 2022, you are looking at a lower price point. It's just the way that these contract negotiations work. You know what his agent is thinking. He's like, I'm comparing him to Shaquille Barrett and some of these other guys who had that explosive breakout year. What did they get paid in that year? Well, let's look at some of these numbers right now. Actually, Shayne, I've got over the cap pulled up right here. The guys who are making roughly in the same ballpark as Alex Highsmith in new annual earnings, that's the $17 million range. And this is up to 17 to 17.5. That's Cameron Jordan, who's 34 years old. Harold Landry, solid football player, 27. Shaquille Barrett is 31. And Chandler Jones is 33 years old. So Highsmith is younger than all of them. He's coming off arguably a better season than the collection of these guys making the same amount of money right now. And so you understand why the Steelers had to give him the contract he did. The agent is just not going to go for less than that. He would have said, no, that's fine. Go ahead and try to franchise us, or we're walking in free agency and we're going to go where the money goes. Now, obviously, Shayne, you hope that this isn't a Bud Dupree situation where it's like you pay the guy and he's very unspectacular on his second deal. I've said this for the last year and a half, 2 years now. I like Highsmith better than Dupree. I just think he's a more pure,
he's a better passer.
Natural. Yes. He's not as stiff. He's a more natural, fluid player. And I think he gets the quarterback just better than what Dupree does. And so
Yeah.
you hope that this is one of those deals, Shayne, that 2 years from now, it's looking like the Steelers got an absolute steal,
Right.
where these guys leapfrogging him are getting 23, 24 million in the same player range as what he is. Do I think that Highsmith is a true edge one? I do not. I think that he is a high-end edge number 2. And what I mean by that is, if he was on his own team, the guy that's double teamed and the guy that's asked to dominate, I don't know if he would perform particularly well in that role. But I think as a compliment to TJ Watt, it's hard to find a player that complements his skill set too much better, because he does have a great get off. He's still a good run defender. He's got a wicked spin move that might be the best in the NFL right now. And so the combination of those two are going to be able to generate a lot of pressure and a lot of hits on the quarterback. And so that's the part that should have fans excited. And I'm excited for that as well. In terms of a team building approach here, Shayne, this is the biggest question floating out there right now. Like, is this the right thing to do? Like, the Steelers mindset, we know what it is. We want to run the football well. We want to play elite defense. Is there enough evidence over the past several years in the NFL, or even going back maybe a decade now, to say, yeah, we can do this. We can get the job done to be Super Bowl champions by playing elite defense and running the football? I think that the philosophy here, you can argue that it's not exactly the winning philosophy in today's NFL.
Yeah, I think that for the Steelers at this point, they clearly have a plan in mind, more so than just simply that. I think it's also that they clearly want to pay and find like elite talent on defense, pay them, and then draft offensive talent that's young and that can be up and coming as the defense continues to stay strong, right? The main reason I think they're doing that is, one, it just is a little bit more sustainable, because if you have an elite wide receiver you can draft, which we're hoping George Pickens can be. If you can draft a running back, even though they're not as valuable, if they're a really good running back, which they're hoping Najee will be this year, it's a really valuable contract for 4 or 5 years, right? Same thing with quarterback. Obviously, if you can have a quarterback on a rookie deal, and I think that's something else that really kind of makes this deal for Highsmith make a little bit more sense from a money perspective, is they have a rookie quarterback contract right now for the next 4 years. They have 4 cost-controlled years of Kenny Pickett. This is the time, if you're going to pay players in general for a 3 to 4 year window, this is the time to do it. You don't want to let $2 million, like you said, separate you from having Alex Highsmith on your team and not having him on your team, right? So I think their strategy overall is, again, just build up the defense as strong as they possibly can by paying the guys that they've drafted well and bring in guys to supplement the roster through free agency, and then draft offense. They drafted offense really heavily the last few years for a good reason. And I think if everything hits, and a lot of this is going to be based on how good is Kenny Pickett, how good can Matt Canada be this year specifically, if everything comes together, they can go very far, because all they need is for Kenny to be good when they need him to be good. Like, it doesn't need to be a situation, especially in the regular season against certain teams. You can beat teams in the regular season outside of the very top teams by playing suffocating defense, controlling the clock, and getting timely big plays in the passing game. But once you do get in the playoffs, at some point, your defense isn't going to matter a whole lot anymore. Once you go up against teams like the Bengals, even the Bills, the Chiefs, sometimes your defense can play perfectly, and it just doesn't matter because that team is too talented offensively, right? That's when you're going to need your offense that is very young, right, to show up and go blow for blow with them. And it's going to be really hard for this team to do that, especially with candidate offensive coordinator. But I understand the team building approach, because you have money to spend right now that you wouldn't have if you were in a situation where you have Big Ben, who's making a lot of money as a franchise quarterback. You're not going to have to worry about that for a few years. So this is the time, if you're going to spend and stretch the books a little bit, this is the time to do it. Like, especially if they have a really strong season this year. If there's a really big time free agent, offensively or defensively, next year that wants a 2 or 3 year deal, the Steelers are going to be a team I think you got to look at for, because they can afford to do it in that window, and then worry about it after Kenny's paid if he plays well enough. So I think overall, I'd like to see more of a focus on skill positions and trying to build up the offense a little bit better through free agency. But they have done that with the offensive line. They've added guys there. So it's hard for me to say that it's the wrong team building approach, as long as what I'm saying now is what they're actually trying to do, which is just supplement the defense with free agents and then draft high quality offensive players.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And so, Shayne, I mean, this is what I would say. If you were starting with a completely clean slate right now, like redrafting the entire NFL, then I wouldn't agree with the Steelers' approach.
No, because you have more options. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing, is like I would do what has proven to be the winning formula in today's NFL. And there has not been a quarterback who has finished like outside the top 7 who hasn't won the Super Bowl in the past decade now. And so I think that I would do more of the offensive approach. I would have my defense that's good enough to get to that point, but it requires a good offense. Now, with the way that the Steelers are currently already built, it's like keep a strength to strength. And the alternative is, I mean, we'll talk about that here in a second, but you keep a strength and strength by adding or keeping a Highsmith around. And you hope that this defense, for what they're spending on the position, can turn it around and be like the defenses of 2019, 2020, where they're a legitimate top 3 defense in the league.
Yes.
If they are that, and you don't have Mason Rudolph and Devlin Hodges as your quarterback, then theoretically, yes, you have a chance to get into the playoffs and maybe win a few games here. I don't love the approach in general, but again, everybody's pointing to right now, Shayne, the Steelers are spending too much on defense. They're spending too much on defense, not enough on offense. It's kind of just the way the contracts are structured right now.
Yeah,
they have a bunch of guys. Yeah, a bunch of guys offensively that are on rookie deals, and that's where the money savings is coming from right now. Eventually, if those guys prove, like if Pickett deserves a new deal, if Pickens deserves a new deal, that's going to flip here eventually. And then it'll be like the stretch from like 2014 to 2017, where the Steelers offense is getting paid more than the defense. So it is self-correcting in a way. But the philosophy in general, I get the arguments against saying, let's spend even more money on the defense, because theoretically you could say, all right, we're just going to refuse to pay this guy, and we're going to take that money and we're going to use it in free agency. And so that is an option. You just don't know what's going to be there. You don't know what the bidding war is going to be like. You have a very solid player on your team entering the prime of his career. He happens to come at one of the 2 or 3 most important positions in football. And so why even chance him just walking away, especially when you don't have an option outside of him? But I think one of the arguments, Shayne, that some fans have made, and I get it to an extent, is, does it matter all that much who you put across from TJ Watt? Because he is so good. Now, as long as you're not putting Malik Reed out there and you at least have a quality football player, you're spending a mid-round pick, whatever, is that guy going to be good regardless because of the situation? I think to an extent, but again, there's different degrees of this, and you have a good football player in Highsmith. You lock him up. I'm okay with that decision. So let's talk about the alternatives here, Shayne, for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Hypothetically, had they not signed Highsmith to a contract and they just let him play out the last year of his deal, what are the options outside of that? Now you've got the franchise tag. Like I said, you can spend your money elsewhere in free agency. Can you come up with a combination of decisions the Steelers could make that would be better than giving this money to Highsmith?
I think so. The problem with it is you really have 3 paths this could go, right? One they chose, which was to pay him now after what he's shown, right? Which I think ultimately, and you kind of touched on it, it's the thing that they can do that they can at least say, we have enough information to make this decision, right?
Yeah.
So that's, I think, another reason why they did it. The second option you alluded to is doing the franchise tag route, which, as much as I hate the franchise tag, it does make sense for teams. Obviously, it's a really good tool for teams. The problem is the franchise tag for 1 year deal with the Edge. I'm not exactly sure what the number is right now, but I know it's more than $17 million if I had to guess, right? So you're going to pay him more in that 1 year than you would any of the years of this contract anyway. Plus, you do have the potential of just losing him again next year. You could look to trade him in that situation for more than you'd get as a comp pick, I'm sure, if you wanted to do that. Get picks, all that good stuff. But again, you're trading in then in that case an asset that you know a lot about and that you've seen grow under your system, and trade them for uncertainty, right? And I think certain teams, it makes sense to do that. But with a team that's trying to win right now, they're not in a rebuild situation, right? If they were in a rebuild situation and they gave this contract, I'd have a lot more questions about it. But because they're not, that route doesn't make a lot of sense. And the other one is you let him go, you get a comp pick for probably a big contract you signed somewhere else, and you look at free agency. And the problem with that is, guess what? Edge rushers as good as Highsmith, even though he's not a true number one, they just really don't get to the market a lot anymore for good reason. So you're probably paying someone maybe less, but who isn't going to be as good. And God forbid if TJ does go down again, you do not want someone, not at the level of Highsmith being your edge one in that situation, because you're not going to rush the passer very well anyway, probably, but definitely not if he's not your number one in that situation. So I think they chose the certain route, even though nothing's certain in the NFL, but it's the most certain they could be about keeping this edge group together, knowing that it's not the deepest group in the world, and they don't want to have to try again with another edge rusher. Because we saw with Bud Dupree, he was essentially a heat-seeking missile, which is great, but he wasn't a good pass rusher, right? It worked enough with TJ. It wasn't like he wasn't productive, but he was productive because of TJ, not just because he's a good player. Whereas I think Highsmith is a good player in his own right separately, who is enhanced even more by TJ taking up a lot of the pressure, right? So again, it's for me, I think it's the best decision they can make if you're just trying to guarantee something. Even if maybe it doesn't work out, I still think I would have felt better doing it than letting everything else that I mentioned play out.
Yeah, I can't tell you, Shayne, how many times I've had the conversation about Alex Highsmith and his future with the Steelers and what they should do with multiple people. And here's what fans need to understand as well. If my option is I'm going to let him walk and say I don't even franchise him. Let's say
just let him go.
Yeah, let's say that this is a solid year, but it's not a franchise tag worthy year.
Right.
You let him walk in free agency. There's no guarantee you're getting a comp pick back at all. And if you do get a comp pick, it might not be nearly as good as you thought, because the money that you spend in free agency is going to work against the comp formula.
It's going to affect
that. It's important to understand that, because it's not like Steelers are getting a surefire third round compensatory pick by letting Alex Highsmith walk. In fact, I think there's very, very little chance of that happening, because the Steelers, they would just go and spend money
else. Yeah, they'd have to put that money somewhere else. Yeah.
And you could argue and say, oh, well, maybe their use of money could potentially be better. Just the odds of that happening just seem slim compared to when we look at these free agent classes the past several years. There's just not a lot out there in terms of guys that have had a really healthy career track like Alex Highsmith has, entering the prime of his career, playing an important position. You've got the stability and consistency that he offers. And so the guys that fit that profile that enter free agency are very slim. They're typically a few studs every year, and those guys go for like guru bucks. And so there's no guarantee you would win a bidding war anyway.
Exactly.
And so, Shayne, what I came to the conclusion of is I think the only thing that made sense, at least somewhat, outside of paying Highsmith an extension, would be if the Steelers said, we're not allocating this much money to the edge position. We are going to trade him for a second round pick. You get the security of having a really high draft pick. And unfortunately, you lose a solid player, but you save that money and you're getting a very good pick for the future. Now, that is very unlike the Steelers to do, although they did trade Chase Claypool last year.
A little bit of a different situation, but still.
Different situation. This was never happening. And this is not something I thought would happen. It's just making more sense than saying, I'm just going to let you walk away for potentially nothing after the season, depending on how the comp formula works out. I'm at least going to get myself a quality second round pick from a team desperate for an edge rusher. And again, the Steelers are not in position to do that anyway, because they don't have anybody outside of TJ Watt. Now, the thing that is important to consider right now, Shayne, is the Steelers are paying the second most money to the edge position in the NFL now with this move. The only one that's higher is the Los Angeles Chargers, and that's with Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa, two guys that have combined for 11 Pro Bowl appearances and have both been considered top 5 players at their position in the past. So that is the difference. Like, Highsmith is nowhere near the level of either one of those guys. Not saying he couldn't be within the next 2 seasons. Mack is kind of on the downward trend right now a little bit. Bosa's leveled off. And so it's possible. It's possible for Highsmith to keep going up and for this duo to be better than that duo, because I expect TJ Watt to be better than either of them if he's healthy. But it is worth considering that this is a good chunk, a good percentage of your total salary cap space that is now dedicated to just one position. It's an important position, but it is just one position. But again, it's the way that the cookie crumbled here. It's the way that the things laid out, Shayne. And like we said, we're not getting distraught over a $2 million difference for potentially losing a guy who is probably the 4th or 5th best player on the entire team, honestly.
Yeah, I think you could make an argument after the top 3 guys that he is just as good of an argument as anybody else. I think the thing to consider too here is, and we talked about it before, is people do harp on the defensive spending versus offensive spending. But again, the context of that, if you look at why that is, it makes total sense. It's not like this is something the Steelers are like doing on purpose necessarily. It's just how their team is set up right now. They have a more veteran defense compared to offense. A lot of the guys are on rookie contracts, and the guys that aren't on rookie contracts on offense are guys who've been brought in on relatively cheap deals, especially for their positions. Like, Ciamolo, Daniels, Cole, like all those guys combined are making, I think, less than $30 million total per year right now. Like it's just not there's not something they're spending a lot of money on because they don't have to. Now they will eventually if everything works out. And you talked about like this will flip the other way once some of the veterans retire or they move on or whatever else may happen. And guys like Pickens and Pickett show up if they play well enough and get second contracts. Like that money will start to even back out. It's just cyclical, right? And most teams go through this. Some teams do have a philosophy that kind of keeps them more on one side than the other, but in general, it's very cyclical based on just how well you draft at certain positions and certain sides of the ball. So again, the alternatives we talked about, like there's just nothing that they could have done other than this that was going to be as safe an option, as much as people hate that. But also, this is a player that you don't want to let go. It's just at the end of the day, you don't want to have to replace a guy like this.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up again, Shane, because the context matters so much.
It does.
It's not like
it's
not like the Steelers front office, even back to Kevin Colbert. It's not like they said, our
we don't
goal
want to
is to
spend
go
on
out and
offense.
spend.
Yeah.
Yes, we're going to go out and spend 3 times as much on defense as we do on offense. It's not that. I mean, that might be what is happening, but that's not their intent. When the excuse me, when things laid out the way they did, Shane, you trade for Minkah Fitzpatrick. He ended up being arguably the best safety in the league. How do you not pay
have to pay? Yeah, you have to pay him. Yeah.
Yes. Prior to that, TJ Watt already exploded as a defensive player. I'm not quite a defensive player of the year before the guy's contract. That happened the year, but he was already arguably the best defensive player in the year, maybe just next to Aaron Donald in 2020 before he got his deal. How do you not pay him? And so if you look at it in context, it's like these Steeler players, they deserve to get paid on the defensive side of the ball. And so the Steelers are doing what they can to keep them around. And so I understand that. So it's not like they said, let's go out and spend 3 times as much on defense. It's just happened to be, they've been drafting well on the defense. Not always, not like Devin Bush, but
all the time.
But let me correct that. They've been hitting on some gems defensively. Cameron Hayward broke out late in his career, obviously still playing at a high level. And so when he got his last deal, there was no reason not to give him that extension. Already his deal is looking good. Like I
don't have any complaints about it.
No, so it's just the way that it worked out. I mean, that's just the way that it is. All right, Shane, one more here before we get ready to wrap up today's show. What do you expect from Alex Highsmith in the future? Let's start with 2023, and then we'll look beyond that even a little bit. Do you think that he can replicate what he did last year? And if he doesn't have 14.5 sacks and leads the league with 5 forced fumbles, like he did in 2022, is there a way that he can still be a better player on film, but maybe just not necessarily have the gaudy numbers that he did this year?
So I think the problem when you're looking at edge rushers, right? So for years and years and years, we've had this back and forth about like, oh, is sacks more important or is this more important than that? It's just hard for most players, other than a guy like a TJ Watt and some other guys, to just consistently put up 10 plus sacks a year. Because a lot of it comes down to effort. A lot of it comes down to situation. Sometimes you're in a situation where you're just not probably going to be the guy that gets home, but you're going to allow someone else to get home, right? Like it's so much about the scheme and how they do stunts, depending on the team. Like it's just hard to consistently get 10 plus sacks in the NFL. So if he doesn't get 10 plus sacks, it doesn't automatically mean he wasn't as good as he was this past year, because maybe it just means TJ finished more of his sacks because he only had 5.5, although it was because of injuries. He still didn't have as many per game, for example, as he did last year. So if he comes back with a 20-ish sack season or close to that, Alex probably isn't going to get 14.5. The forced fumbles can be fluky unless you're like Shaquille Leonard or TJ Watt. Like those are kind of the two guys that if you want a forced fumble, you're probably going to get one from them most years, or at least a few. That might not happen again, but again, he showed chops to be able to do that last year, so maybe that is going to stay consistent. It's really just going to be about how often is he winning? How much pressure is he putting on the quarterback? Is he funneling guys over to TJ, where if you send him TJ's way, he's going to get off eventually? You can't keep him tied up forever unless they hold him and they don't call it, which that's a whole other thing that we can talk about some other time. But in general, like I don't think his stats necessarily have to be the same as they were last year to be worth the contract or to be as good. It's just going to come down to what he looks like on a week-to-week basis. Can he be even more consistent? Can he get several pressures a game? And if he gets, for example, 60, 65 pressures, but only 7 of them are sacks, it's not because he didn't pressure the quarterback. He just maybe didn't finish as many plays, and that'll happen. So I think the thing that Steelers fans should look at is when you're watching, just look for him. Is he winning consistently one-on-ones? Is he setting the edge well in the run game, even better than he did last year, where I think he did improve last year? With him and TJ on the field, can offenses just handle them in general, or is one of them always getting in the backfield? Like that's what you should be looking at. And if you're seeing that same type of stuff again, then the contract is going to be well worth it.
Shayne, I could not agree more. The film always trumps the raw numbers, always. And it doesn't matter what position you're looking at here. Raw numbers can be so fraudulent. And if you're going into this contract extension with the mindset of, well, he's got to have more than 14 and a half sacks for this to be worth it, please do not look at it like that. You've already failed.
Happen usually.
Yes, it's the likelihood that he repeats or goes above that and gets 15 plus sacks is it's very unlikely for an edge two when Watt's going to be soaking up so much. Hayward's going to take his bite of the apple. Don't judge the contract and what Highsmith does on his sack production totals. There are so many things that matter more than that. The tape obviously is number one, but there's pass rush win rates. There's double team rate. There's a ton of things that he can do. Run stop percentage. There's a ton of things that Highsmith can do to prove his worth on this contract extension rather than just put up gaudy sack numbers. It just doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things. Because honestly, Shayne, probably what's happening, if Highsmith does have another 14 and a half sacks plus next year, it probably means that some of those have been taken away from Watt and from Hayward, and
guys running away from those two, and Highsmith cleans it up, and that's fine. So someone has to. So.
It's fine, and I'm glad whoever gets it, and they're all under contract, so it's not like, oh, I want these guys to get it because this guy has a contract coming up or anything that way. Whoever gets it, and that's fine. But in the same breath, Shayne, if TJ Watt goes and has 9.5 sacks last year or next year, and Highsmith gets 14.5, I'm not going to be fooled into thinking that Highsmith is suddenly a better player now. Because he's had 2 straight years of more sacks than TJ Watt. The sack total does not create the player. And I use Max Crosby sometimes as an example of a really, really good pass rusher. I think he's a top 5 in the league at his position. He's only had 1 year of sack totals above 10. And so it does not mean he has not been a great player prior to that. He's consistently one of the top pressure players in the NFL, and he's always impacting the play. So don't look at just raw sack numbers to say, to try to grade how good somebody is. Another example here, Shayne, but before we sign off, Alex Highsmith had more sacks and he had more forced fumbles than Micah Parsons did. Does it mean he's a better player? No, it doesn't. Parsons is one of the best in the league. And so again, not taking a thing away from Highsmith, I'm so pleased with this selection. One of the best picks, if not the best day 2 pick in that third round or in the 2020 NFL draft. Just an excellent selection. The guy deserved to be paid. I'm so happy for him and the money that he was able to make from being a former 0-star recruit, college walk-on, a guy that played like 3-4 base end for Charlotte before moving positions, which is bizarre. Just worked his butt off to the point where he is right now. Definitely happy for the guy. Excited for what he brings in the future. I'm not going to look at this in terms of he needs to reach this number of sacks to be successful. Let the film decide. And if you need help deciding what the film looks like, come and talk to Shayne or I, and we'll let you know what we think of the film.
Yeah, for sure.
But that's basically how it works. And so I don't think, Shayne, if you had to guess right now, like percentage of fans that are pleased with this contract, let's say 3 years from now, what percent, which is an arbitrary stat, but what percent would you put that are pleased with this contract?
3 years from now, I like to think it's going to be at least like 75% or more. I think that there's always going to be that contingent that, like, unless he does put up the sack numbers, they're just not going to think he's good. And that's just kind of how it is with football fans. And I get it. Like, it's easier just to say that guy had a lot of sacks, so he's good. And it makes sense in your head. And if you don't know, you don't know. I can't punish people for something they don't know. But like outside of those people, I think that he is going to bring value on this contract. And I think fans will be very happy that he was on the team.
Yeah, I think that that's probably a good like over under right there. I was thinking like 70-ish. So I'd probably go a little bit under, but I think that fans are going to be pleased. I mean, again, like we said, Shayne, 2 years from now, Highsmith's deal is going to it's probably going to look like a good deal as long as he plays like he did.
It might not even be in the top 20 of edges. It might not be in 2 years. So. Yeah, it very well might not be. So.
And the guy has stayed healthy. Knock on wood. I hope that he stays healthy in the future here. Because that again is another big asset. You got a guy that can go out and play 85+% of snaps for the Steelers. That's very valuable. So definitely at least at the very least, Shayne, I think you and I can both agree that we're glad to have him locked up before this becomes a contract dispute and carries into the preseason here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for joining us today on the show. You can follow Shayne on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, check us out on YouTube or ask Alexa to play the Steel Curtain podcast. And thanks for listening to the Steel Curtain podcast.